The abolition of slavery in 1865 was meant to be a new start for Black Americans. After more than 300 years since the beginning of the practice in the colonies that made up the United States of America, people of African ancestry had gained their freedom through the enactment of the Emancipation Proclamation. However, what followed was a difficult period in which previously enslaved peoples faced economic and social hardships, beginning in the Reconstruction era, where a country devastated by civil war was also attempting to deal with the challenge of reintegrating the southern states who had just fought for their secession. While the Civil Rights Act of 1866 declared that all people in the United States are citizens without distinction of race or color or previous condition of slavery or involuntary servitude. In plain words, all people are equal. States would, however, enforce their own laws that diminished the legislation. Laws disenfranchising African Americans were put in place during and after Reconstruction in the form of voter suppression and political exclusion, leaving African Americans with very little representation. In subsequent decades, similar efforts to enforce laws to protect the rights of African Americans would meet the same fate, such as the 14th and the 15th Amendments and also the Civil Rights Act of 1871. States would find workarounds to deny the rights of its black populations, going as far as declaring African Americans not to fall under the category of people. The Supreme Court itself would declare in 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson that public facilities for black and white people should be separate but equal, including institutions like schools and churches. Jim Crow laws legalized racial segregation, leaving little opportunity for economic mobility. The influence of these laws would be particularly bad in the southern states. This would be significant as the civil rights movement took shape, but more on that later. The early years of the 20th century also saw the establishment of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, formed by a group of activists including W.E.B. Du Bois and early Pan-Africanists and civil rights activists. Significant change will not occur until the 1960s, when tougher legislation would usher in a new era of race relations in America as a result of the civil rights movements. After serving in the Second World War, black men and women returned to their country only to face discrimination for the same country they had served. The continued discontent from centuries of inequality led to the movement, which included protests in the form of civil disobedience and boycotts. It's hard to pinpoint exactly when the movement started, but a number of key events early on set the ball rolling. On 17th of May 1954, the Supreme Court ruled that the segregation of public schools was unconstitutional in Brown v. Board of Education. This seminal case gathered 5 separate cases relating to segregation in public schools, and with the decisive win would usher in desegregation. In 1955, a 14-year-old black boy visiting family in the southern state of Mississippi was lynched after allegedly flirting with a white woman. This was done by her husband and his brother. 2 weeks later, an all-white, all-male jury found the men not guilty. 70 years later, Carolyn Bryan, the woman who had made these allegations, will recant her testimony. The victim, Emmett Till, had become another in a long list of black people to be victims of lynchings. His mother would carry out an open casket funeral, ensuring that the world saw the brutality that his son had endured. His death would mobilize many more to join the civil rights movements. But probably the most well-known story of the civil rights movements was that of Rosa Parks. About 100 days after the death of Emmett Till, Rosa Parks, a civil rights activist and NAACP member, was arrested after refusing to give up a seat to white passengers upon the request of the bus driver. A few days later, activists in the Montgomery Improvement Association in Alabama leveraged the event to begin a boycott of buses. Their demands were clear: that black passengers were treated with courtesy, that seating would be offered on a first-come first-served basis regardless of race, and for black drivers to be on predominantly black routes. Their demands were not met. Instead, the city would attempt to frustrate the efforts of the boycotters. Carpool drivers who provided alternative transport for those boycotting would be harassed by the police. The boycott would see the rise of a young minister at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, a Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. King's home would be bombed as a result of his support for the boycott. He would also be tried by city officials and convicted on trumped-up charges. The boycotts would gain support from outside Montgomery. Following principles of non-violent protests as demonstrated by Mahatma Gandhi in India, Dr. King would successfully lead the boycott. After a year of lost revenue, the company operating the buses were forced to desegregate after a Supreme Court ruling that the segregation laws were unconstitutional. Dr. King's model of non-violent protest was propagated around the US in challenging discriminatory laws. Remember the Brown v. Board of Education ruling? Well, despite the legal requirements to desegregate schools, attempts to integrate were often met with violence. On one occasion, President Eisenhower had to call in federal troops to protect 9 black children trying to attend a white school. The governor of Arkansas, Orville Forbes, who was determined to stop the children from attending the school, had called in the National Guard. In his later years, he would claim to be acting to prevent property damage and violence. Questionable given his earlier claim at a news conference that the federal government was trying to come in and cram integration down southern throats. His speeches also suggest strong political motivation for opposing integration in schools. This and other events like it demonstrated the practical challenges of enacting change. On its own, legislation would not be sufficient. It would take courageous acts such as those by the civil rights activists for change to occur. Despite the Supreme Court ruling, it would take a few more years for the schools in Arkansas to be fully integrated. Another form of non-violent protest was the use of sit-ins. African Americans would force public facilities such as libraries, theaters, and beaches to desegregate. The Freedom Riders, a mixed group of black and white activists, would test the Supreme Court's decision in 1960 that permitted desegregated buses. Once again, the limitation of legislature was witnessed as a mob in Alabama threw a bomb at the bus, setting it on fire and beating the riders. But perhaps the most famous moment of the movements took place during the March in Washington, when 250,000 demonstrators protested the lack of employment available to African Americans. Taking place the day after the death of W.E.B. Du Bois, Dr. King delivered his now famous I Have a Dream speech in an attempt to persuade the government, led by J.F. Kennedy, to deliver stronger civil rights. The speech itself was not completely new. It contained sections of similar speeches he had given previously, but with some improvisations on this occasion. Whilst not all civil rights activists were in support of the march, it gave more recognition both domestically and internationally to the civil rights movement. One of its objectives was Malcolm X, born Malcolm Little. He was a key figure in the Nation of Islam, a civil rights group who did not exactly see eye to eye with the non-violent movements. You see, the civil rights movement itself was not just a single group. And although Martin Luther King Jr. would become the face of it, especially in modern day, it's worth remembering that whilst it was mostly non-violent, other groups fighting for the same right would propose a different approach. Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam were seen as black nationalists and militants, spreading a message that puts African Americans as people chosen by God. Malcolm X would eventually leave the Nation of Islam and convert to Sunni Islam, taking a more moderate stance. The Black Panthers would teach a Marxist-Leninist version of political advocacy. Like the Nation of Islam, they were considered controversial and even more militant, sometimes partaking in fatal shootouts with law enforcement. Chairman of the Illinois chapter and prominent activist, Fred Hampton, would later be assassinated by the FBI. He was just 21. But the assassination of civil rights leaders was not new. Over the years, many had been attacked, and some killed. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X would also be assassinated. That each of these leaders were killed after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 under Lyndon B. Johnson shows just how significant the struggle for equality was. Along with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, these acts banned discrimination based on race, religion, sex, or nationality and got rid of voting restrictions. More laws would be passed to bring about equality even until today. Legislation against discriminatory house policies and police reform, to name a few. The civil rights movements of the 50s and 60s would mark a significant chapter in African American struggle for equality. The changes it brought about would allow for the rise of many prominent figures, including Shirley Chisholm, the first black congresswoman, Claudette Colvin, who first appeared on the scene as a 15-year-old before Rosa Parks and refused to give up a seat on the segregated bus in Alabama, and many others across politics, literature, and academia. The struggle endured by this generation of African American men and women allowed today's generation of underrepresented groups to engage at all levels of society, from the world of work to politics, ultimately benefiting all of society.